Today we think of the Supreme Court as a very important and powerful part of the American political and legal process. But it wasn't always this way. Early on, the Supreme Court didn't hold that much power. This began to change because of a single decision in 1803 in a case called Marbury versus Madison, which is what I'm going to be discussing today. Hello, my name is Ben, and I'm a first-year law student taking my first class in constitutional law this semester. The purpose of this video is just a learning exercise for myself to try to describe this case, Marbury versus Madison, in a way that's very easy to understand, even for someone who has no background or knowledge in this case or anything about it in general. So the main things that I'm going to discuss in this video are going to be the background, the case, and why it's important. So first, we're going to talk about the background, which I think is the most interesting part. So some things that are important to know is that this case takes place in 1803, which is obviously not too far after America has been founded. So all of the founding fathers, the people who wrote the Constitution, are all still alive, and in fact, many of them are major players in this. So this takes place right after John Adams' presidency and right when Thomas Jefferson becomes the third president of the United States. So some important factors to keep in mind here are that the event that caused this lawsuit in the first place happened in 1801, right before Thomas Jefferson was about to take office. So one thing that's important to understand is that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were originally good friends, and they liked each other. But as a part of what we even see in today's modern political process, during the course of their election, there was a lot of things that were said and done that kind of caused some really bad blood between these two. And I think some of the things that happened that were a really big factor in causing this are kind of interesting and important to talk about to understand why this even happened in the first place. So the first one that I'll talk about that I think is kind of interesting is, just like we see in modern day politics, there were lies/rumors that were spread about both people. For example, John Adams had a rumor spread about him by Thomas Jefferson's camp that he was a hermaphrodite, which you can imagine at the time was a pretty big deal, something that people cared about, something that people thought was a bad thing. And in response, John Adams' camp spread a rumor that actually was true, that Thomas Jefferson had fathered a child with one of his slaves. And then in response to that, Thomas Jefferson made a rumor about John Adams that was completely fabricated, that once he was reelected, he was going to start a war with France. And none of those things are particularly important to understand the actual case, but I just think that that's important background information to understand why something like what happened would happen in the first place. Now, to get on to the actual event that caused this lawsuit, at the end of John Adams' administration, right before he was going to pass it over to Thomas Jefferson, he wanted to basically make his mark right before he left, something kind of in spite of Thomas Jefferson. He basically just wanted to piss Thomas Jefferson off. So one of the things that he did, people refer to these as the Midnight Judges, I believe, where basically John Adams just took a bunch of people that were within his political camp, people that he liked or whatever, and he gave them positions in like the judiciary. And one of like the example like in this case was that John Adams appointed this guy, William Marbury, as I think it's like Justice of the Peace or something, right? And to be completely honest, I don't really know exactly what this means, but or in terms of like what he would do in that position. But so he gives him this position like literally like on the night before Thomas Jefferson takes over the administration. Just as like one last thing to be like, screw you, Jefferson, have fun with this, basically. And the problem with this was not with what he did physically. It was more so that there was a slight error in what happened. So John Adams, Secretary of State, was a man named John Marshall, who ends up being incredibly important in this case. And John Marshall, was like giving these orders or job offers or appointments or whatever you'd like to say to each of these people that were given them. But he made a mistake, and for whatever reason, he forgot about William Marbury's. And there's nothing really particularly important or special about William Marbury, from my understanding. And I'm far from being an expert, so I really don't know. But it kind of seems like, from my perspective, that he was just kind of like a nobody. So maybe that's why he forgot or whatever. But he literally, I'm pretty sure, left the letter that he was supposed to have given to him somewhere in the White House, right? And then, the next day, Jefferson, he comes in or whatever. And then Jefferson's Secretary of State, which is James Madison, he, I think he finds this or somebody gives it to him or whatever, right? The letter that is, appointing William Marbury to be Justice of the Peace. And basically, they're like, yeah, we're not going to give that to him because screw John Adams. That's basically the reason. That's basically what happened. After that, William Marbury was obviously pretty pissed. So he filed a lawsuit, right? And it went straight to the Supreme Court. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was none other than John Adams, Secretary of State, John Marshall. And he did not recuse himself from this, even though, I don't know, maybe he should have. I feel like definitely looking at it now, it kind of would make sense that he would have some sort of bias in this. But back then, I guess they didn't care, or maybe there was nothing they could do, or something. I really don't know. But then, obviously, the arguments were made, on both sides of, should he get his appointment, and if he should, how should it happen, right? And I'm not going to spend too much time delving into that in great specifics. Well, all you really need to know is that essentially John Marshall, he decided that the answer was yes. Should he be awarded his appointment? Yes, he should. And the vehicle that would be used to cause this is something called a writ of mandamus. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but that's what it is. And basically, this is just a written order to make somebody do something. In this case, it would be James Madison to, deliver the appointment to William Marbury. So that's the idea, right? And that sounds great for William Marbury. And it would have been, unless John Marshall did something that was actually quite brilliant. He decided that, and I don't know the exact reasons behind this. You have to talk to an expert or watch a video explaining super in depth why he needed to make this decision, because I don't really know a ton about that, but it had to do with basically not wanting to make the Supreme Court look weak or, bad or, something like that. And what he ended up doing was, John Marshall, what he ended up doing was stating that the Supreme Court did not have jurisdiction over this case and therefore couldn't rule over it. Which, obviously ended up causing William Marbury, I'm sure, to be pissed. And, he did not get his appointment. And the idea behind this was basically the Judiciary Act of 1789 said that the Supreme Court could have original jurisdiction over cases in which you could force somebody to do something through the writ of mandamus. And essentially, he declared that this was unconstitutional due to, I think it might be, I'm not going to say a number because I don't want to be wrong, but a section of the Constitution that basically says that the Supreme Court can only have original jurisdiction over cases where it's involving like state matters or things like foreign diplomats or something like that. And if I'm wrong about that, my apologies, but I believe that that's the case. So he said that act that allowed this case to come to the court in the first place, for them to have original jurisdiction over the case, was unconstitutional. So basically, that's what happened. And what's really interesting about this case is that what he did was completely unprecedented. And by he, I mean John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. No one had ever done anything like that before, because basically what he did was he gave the Supreme Court a very important power, and he just did it. He didn't ask anybody if he could do it. He just did it. He said, this federal law, the Judiciary Act of 1789, that's literally like the only thing I have written on my screen, by the way, but he said that act is unconstitutional because of that clause in the Constitution, which I should have had written down as here as well, but I do not. And by doing so, he made it null. It no longer was worth anything. It was overruled, which, the Supreme Court does things like that fairly frequently in terms of, if you look at the past, 100 years or whatever, right? It's something that the Supreme Court does. It's called judicial review. And he basically imbued the Supreme Court with this power by the decision of this case. It didn't turn out great for William Marbury, but it turned out really good for the Supreme Court, which was the whole point. John Marshall, his entire angle at this case was that he didn't want the Supreme Court to look bad. And he ended up making the Supreme Court look good and giving it more power than it had before the case, and literally changing the course of the American political landscape for the next several hundred years. This stuff still matters today, which is really interesting, and part of why I thought it would be cool to make this video. And a lot of this for me was just a test to see how well I could explain it, and I think I did all right. You can let me know if you think you get it, think you understand what this case was all about. And also let me know if you enjoyed the video. But that's basically it. And I hope you enjoyed. I hoped that I was fairly clear and concise. And if you liked the video, let me know. And let me know if you want me to do anything else like this in the future. Thank you so much for watching.